Welcome everybody to webinar, all that you need to know about security in the contact center. This is proudly hosted and sponsored by Online Business Systems. And I'm very pleased to introduce Chris Theriault, Gord Hooker, and Dennis Charette from their customer engagement and cybersecurity teams. And I'll turn it over to you fellas. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. Much appreciated. I'm going to throw up just a couple slides to tell us a little bit about ourselves and background, just to set some context, and then we'll dive right into discussing our topic of today. So thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to this webinar, sponsored by Online and hosted by Contact New Brunswick in partnership. And we are talking about what you need to know about security in the contact center, out with the old and in with the new. I am Chris Theriault, Senior Director at Online Business Systems with the Customer Engagement Practice, dealing with all things contact center. Online has been a consultancy based out of Winnipeg for over 35 years now, specializing in risk and security and digital transformation. Large umbrella there with digital transformation, with many would-be sub-practices within, so contact center being one of them. Along with practices like Salesforce skills and consulting work, service management with partnerships with BMC and Freshdesk, and customer engagement partnering with Five9 as a CCaaS platform as well. This is a bit of an infographic about Online, the things we do, kind of things we believe in, a message from our great CEO, Chuck Lowen, as well. Just kind of outlining all those practices I just described about Online as well. So on the line, or in this panel with us today, so alongside me is Gord Hooker and Dennis Charette, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gord maybe to introduce himself a little bit.
Sure, thanks, Chris. Gord Hooker. I'm actually based out of Vancouver Island, out on the west, so the other shore. And I've been working as a PCI QSA for a number of years. Prior to that, working in security operations. Prior to that, IT and a whole bunch of other things, kind of a lifelong nerd, if you will. So, one of the things I tend to spend a lot of time with is customers that have contact centers, and particularly in the PCI realm. So I've been exposed to a lot of different technologies and call centers, assessed a lot of different call centers, and I've been lucky enough to see some pretty neat stuff. So hopefully I can throw in some good insights today that might help some of the people out here with their call centers.
Awesome, thanks, Gord. Yeah, much appreciated for your expertise today. And also Dennis Charette, if you can introduce yourself, Dennis.
Absolutely. Hi, my name is Dennis Charette. I'm based out of Connecticut, USA. Currently, I'm a senior customer engagement consultant for Online. I've been happily an onliner since November of 21. However, I really did get my start way back in '96 as an application developer for a local telco company. Obviously, within the past 27 years, held a lot of different positions. However, most of my experiences have been with like DevOps engineering roles, supporting always contact center technologies. Most recently, I've been able to work as through my employment with Online. I've been able to work with many clients implementing and administrating cloud-based telco solutions, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to be involved in many projects integrating secure payment functionality, which will be one of our topics that we're going to discuss today. So thank you for taking time out of your schedules, and hopefully, is to say what Gord said, hopefully some of my personal experiences and insight will be able to provide you some good relationships to today's topics.
Awesome. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Gord. Maybe we'll jump right in. So we kind of engineered this as more of a kind of a discussion set. We're going to delve on some topics, and I'm just going to share, kind of the overarching themes of each of the topics we broached. So bear with me here. I'm going to share another screen here. So maybe our very first topic, a question I may be able to pose to Gord, maybe why is security important? And what are some of the ways to mitigate risks? to sensitive data in a contact.
All right. Yeah, let's just jump right into it. So why is security important? Well, in a contact center, if nothing else, you've got to validate the identity of your caller. So, automatically you're going to be receiving some sensitive data. And beyond that, if you have a contact center that accepts payments, now there's a potential for payment data being exposed to risk as well. So, right from the get-go, that customer has to provide some sensitive data to you. So, to look at the risks, we really just kind of follow the data. So, how are your agents getting it? Are the customers saying it out loud? Are they in a public location, maybe a coffee shop? Could somebody be listening to them? Perhaps they're keying it in on their phone with their, touch tones. And basically, from the point it enters the call center, that voice traffic or the tones will come into your contact center. And actually, maybe before I go any further, I should talk a little bit about DTMF tones, because I'm going to use that term a lot today. So a DTMF tone, which is dual tone multi-frequency, is just the tone you hear when you push the button on your phone. It's two tones together, dual tone, two different frequencies. So your customer's voice or their DTMF tones are getting transmitted from the point where, well, I guess all the way from their phone or them speaking into their phone, all the way to your agent workstations, or whether it's a soft phone or a hard phone. And that traffic is commonly not encrypted. So that data is traversing your VoIP systems and networks. And potentially you've got automated systems such as IVR, transcription software, software that might be turning those tones into digits, which then become another form of sensitive data. Though that data, transcripted data, is going to be transiting your networks, and in some cases it's actually going to be stored. So another thing is call recording systems. I mean, most contact centers will record calls for quality assurance and training. So your call recording systems may be capturing those interactions, including the sensitive data, and that could actually create a repository. If they're being stored for a period of time, you've now got a repository of sensitive data. The agents would typically hear, and then they'd be entering that data into some sort of application, maybe a web application. And there again, that data entry is potentially transmission to some web application and storage of that sensitive data.
Yeah, that could be pretty important. I mean, do we have examples maybe? I know I may have one of how that may be mitigated within the contact center. I know Dennis, did you have a story to tell around?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mentioned before, right, some of the experience that I had in contact center technologies. One of the things that I've done is basically travel to different contact centers to see and observe agent activity on day to day. And especially as times have changed right now, right? We have a lot of these shared office spaces. We have the open room concept, and basically a lot of agents, right, sitting together in tight spaces. So as Gord was mentioning about hearing the tones and whatnot, or the agent activities, what I've noticed in some of those experiences is that having all that, you could hear the agents repeating back to the customer, social sensitive information such as cards, social security information, etc. Depending on what their processes are, I've actually seen them in real time writing down those numbers on sticky notes that they're going to later enter into some web-based process to submit a payment, or even if they're doing an active online order, just taking that information, speaking it out loud for anyone to pick up. And sometimes these spaces, especially they're with a lot of consolidation that we've been doing with the on-prem work. A lot of times this is even shared. So the exposure isn't just within your own agents, it's potentially with other folks that are just happen to be in the area as well. So definitely seen that, and it opened up my eyes quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely exposing lots of risk there for sure. I'm sure it's something you noted down in your observations as well. I mean,
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the
creates that
kind of thing.
requirement. Yeah, go
That's the
ahead,
kind of
Gord.
thing as a PCI assessor that definitely makes me cringe a little bit when I hear about people writing stuff down. So hopefully that doesn't happen too much.
I'm sure.
Um,
It's it's created a requirement for a PCI, paperless work environment sometimes as well when seeking out contact centers. So the mitigation of not having anything on the desk itself of an agent to be able to write something down in that sense that it may get lost or misplaced. And
Right.
even transitioning into the remote agent world, I've seen some providers use technologies that are kind of the same technologies they use in exam writing, or virtual exam writing or remote, where they leverage the camera of the agent's PC to observe what's around them if there are other people around or there's things on the desktop that can be used for quality management as well. So definitely things to consider there.
Nice.
Absolutely.
Well, maybe that's probably a good segue for me to talk about some other ways of mitigating risk. So maybe
Yeah.
I'll just run through, kind of some of the things we've talked about so far and talk about some of the ways you can mitigate that risk. So I guess the first one is if you're thinking of right from the point where your caller is providing you their information, there's a risk of that data being disclosed. So, like they're sitting in a coffee shop, they're having to give you a social insurance number or a credit card number or something. Um, so how can we mitigate that? Well, I mean, the easiest way is if you can actually accept that data with DTMF tones, then the person, it's a little bit more secure for the person to kind of, be holding their phone in front of them and keying in the data rather than saying it out loud. So that's a good way to mitigate that one. The next one is when you've got those, either voice or DTMF tones coming into the contact center, as I mentioned before, oftentimes that data is not encrypted. So it's really important to protect those networks, keep them as small as possible, and then use firewalls and intrusion detection and prevention and other tools, to make sure those networks are secure so that there's just, a minimum of risk to that data as it's moving around unencrypted on your network. The next thing is, there's a risk of access by individuals who don't need access to that information. And, the practice here is you should always limit access to sensitive data based on job requirement. So if somebody doesn't need for their job access to, whether it's stored or in transit, so hearing it, they should not be able to get to it. The next one is the risk of the data that's being entered by the agent. So they're hearing it over the phone, they're typing it in. What you want to look for there is that those, any connection from that point on is encrypted. So if the agent is logged into a web application that they're using in your contact center, you should always be sure that you're using strong cryptography to encrypt that connection. Another one is if soft phones are being used. Some soft phones do support encryption. So if you have the ability to enable encryption within your soft phones, definitely be sure you're doing that. Next one is, so suppose your contact center actually has a need to store some of this sensitive data. There are some pretty neat technologies out there. So in the credit card space, there are service providers who will use a thing called tokenization. And for anybody not familiar with tokenization, it's basically a service provider essentially creates a lookup table of here's this sensitive piece of information, such as your credit card number, and here's a piece of information, a code that we'll use in place of that. And that service provider is the only entity that can actually look up one to the next. So when that token is stored within your systems, if anybody gets that, it's absolutely meaningless to them. They can't do anything with it. They have to have access to this third-party service provider in order to look up that token and retrieve say a credit card for it. Next thing is automated pause and resume on call recording. And this is kind of a neat technology in that what it allows you to do is, so again, let's look at the scenario. You're in your contact center, your agent's logged into your system, they're getting the caller's name, they're asking them a few questions. They get to the point where they need to get a piece of sensitive data from them. So they're something to authenticate their identity or getting payment information. At that point, as they tab into the field where they enter that, a signal goes out from their workstation out to your call recording software to say, stop recording or pause recording now. The agent then receives or hears the information from the customer and enters it in. And as they tab out of that field, the recording resumes. So now your call recording has everything up to the point where the caller was providing their data. It paused and then resumed afterwards. So now you don't have that sensitive data in your call recording. And another probably more recent technique is using a thing called DTMF tone masking. And what that does is there's a piece of technology that sits in the stream of voice traffic coming in and will detect when the customer is entering tones. And what it will do is block out those tones and substitute like a single tone or a click or some other noise so the agent can tell the person's entering card data, but can't actually hear it. And so the advantage of DTMF tone masking is not only does it keep it out of the call recordings, it also keeps those from transiting a lot of the network that they're on. So your VoIP systems beyond that the DTMF tone masking technology doesn't actually get exposed to any of that sensitive data.
And I think
So
that helps in the recording as well, right? So I mean, like taking that recording later and listening to the tones. I know there could be software out there to interpret them, so masking those are a great way of
it's relatively trivial to for an attacker to interpret those tones. In fact, I've been told that some people can develop an ear for it and can actually hear the numbers and actually could tell you what they are just right out of their own head.
Oh wow!
So which is
the Rain Man of stealing card numbers.
Great way to put it, Dennis. That's true.
Yeah. And so the one other thing is the actual kind of old school risk of compromise. So whether it's an insider or an outsider, somebody wants to essentially a hacker wants to get in and try and steal whatever data you do have stored. So if you're not using these technologies to prevent storage, for example. So and really this is kind of all about doing IT well. So make sure your systems are hardened so they're configured securely. They have been patched, so you're keeping them up to date with security vulnerabilities, and particularly the critical security vulnerabilities. So just for a point of reference, the PCI requirement, payment card industry, requires that you install 30 critical patches within 30 days of release. So, they require a pretty quick turnaround. And I mean, in a lot of organizations, some of the really critical stuff, sometimes it's hours or at most days that they're, when you see these really, really critical vulnerabilities come along. Minimizing the attack surface, that goes back to, we talked about, if somebody doesn't need access to it, don't provide access to it. So don't, make sure the firewalls are blocking everything. Only the people who need to get to it can see it, those kind of things. Another one is multi-factor authentication, so that if somebody gets a hold of a user's credentials, they can't just use them to log in. They actually need another factor, such as, a token on a soft phone or some other thing. And the last one, which may be the most important, I shouldn't say it may be the most important, but it's very, very important, is your security awareness training. That in today's day and age, very few attacks are actually, brute force figuring out somebody's password. No, it's somebody sent an email and said, hey, have you checked your we've got a problem with your account. You need to log in and confirm your identity and confirm your credentials. And they click the link, which goes somewhere else that looks exactly like where they think they should be going. They enter their credentials, and now your attacker, you didn't have to do any hard work. You've just given them your credentials. So training can be really important to make sure that they don't find an easy way into your systems.
Yeah, we're living in an era where we're getting exposed to that quite often, right? Through via email, but and also text these days. Everyone's getting those text messages or even those robocalls that are tough to identify. So social engineering, right?
Yep.
Very good. All right, that's fantastic. We'll move on to the next topic, and maybe this is a question for Dennis. I'm going to just put up our slide with our topic of choice. So maybe Dennis, maybe we can talk a little bit about when is the best time to integrate security into your contact center roadmap. Is there a good time?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, the quick answer to that is as soon as possible, right? You know, we've talked about a lot of the risk and exposures. So from a timing perspective, really what you want to do is get going with your security integration as soon as you can, and especially if you have projects that are starting up new, doing some new system builds, it's a perfect time to start to really think about what you need to do and what your risks and exposures are and how you need to set up your infrastructure to support that. That when you address these issues up front, basically what's going to happen is it's going to really allow you to think in advance to basically put yourself in a position to have the best operations and work and design up front, because you're thinking about it before you put the projects in place, and it's not necessarily just an afterthought. And then when you talk about that, planning ahead, et cetera, one of the things that, you know, kind of happen right in the topic of conversations is everyone talks about project costs, et cetera, et cetera. And oftentimes if security is brought up maybe as an afterthought, you start to look at it from an expense to say, oh geez, we might not have the dollars that we need to fit this, and people kind of take some unexpected risks at that point. But really what you have to look at is when you look at it ahead and you plan ahead, that's your perfect time to reduce and become more efficient with some of those costs. And also, it'll perhaps help you divert some of the expenses that could happen with those exposures later on. Another thing to consider as we go through this process is what are the current compliance requirements? They're sort of evolving, right? And we're trying to get more and more secure. So when you understand your current and future state of these requirements, and you weigh that in with your appetite for how much risk that you are willing to take as an organization, that'll help kind of drive what your roadmap should be as it relates to integrating and putting secure systems in place. Another thing to consider when we talk about this is data breaching. And what does that mean to your organization, right? If you have a data breach, we hear about it all the time on the news. We see things happening. What does that mean to you? How does that impact you and your business? So everything from customer trust, right? You hear something in the news and the media, and you're like, oh, geez, wow, that's a little risky. The penalties that could come across with it. So you lose business, you lose customers, penalties by not being properly compliant, and then any extra costs that you have now to kind of turn that whole thing around. So that's why it's best to really think about it up front as much as possible. So that's pretty much my first thought about it.
Yeah, you know, Dennis, that it reminds me of so one of my clients is actually a Canadian university, and just thinking of, like, you know, the trade-off of using service providers versus homegrown, and you know, additional risk of breaches you may get from that. So this university several years ago implemented what they termed a zero footprint strategy for payments. And that strategy has driven their whole roadmap for development of their systems around, you know, some of it is inbound calls, but it's fairly low, but there's, you know, a lot of different payment flows. And what they've done is, and what they mean by this zero footprint is, they don't want to have any payment data stored or transiting their networks at all. So what they did was they used service providers for pretty much everything, and even to the point, and you know, this is admittedly not a luxury that a lot of us working in the contact center space would have, but they actually used analog phone systems and mobile networks to keep the card data off their systems. So, rather than using the university's, great big VoIP system they actually ran analog lines, and their systems that they're using to connect to the service providers actually use mobile networks. So they're not transiting the university's data network.
Wow.
So as a result of this, they don't have any cardholder data storage. They don't have any cardholder data transmission. And one of the results of this is there are no what we call in PCI world sensitive areas, which means now you don't have to have elaborate physical security systems. So badge access systems, security guards, video cameras, all of the access management and review that goes along with all those systems, escorting maintenance workers. There's all these other things that you save on by doing that. So, in some ways you think, oh, it's going to cost me X amount of dollars to hire a service provider to do these things. But at the same time, there are many other positive benefits of doing that. And, many of them are cost related. So it's, definitely something to give some serious consideration to if you're looking at it.
So Gord, with that thought, I mean, that's very interesting. With that thought, does some of the risk itself, right, when you use the service providers, basically what you're saying is it sort of offloads the risk from the client up upon to the service
Exactly.
provider, and that's what they're experienced in, and that's what they do.
Exactly right. You're transferring your risk over to a service provider that maybe that's all they do. So that's their core business. They put all their effort into that, and so you're not reinventing the wheel. You're leaving that to Michelin.
Right. Right. Well, we have a question in the chat. Maybe this is a good point to interject here. So Cheryl asked us in chat, what's the best way for an organization to stay on top of what the current compliance requirements are when they do actually change? Is there a good place for people to look for that information?
Would it be bad for us to say ask a consultant?
Well done, Gord. Good luck.
Yeah, maybe that's a good example of maybe farming it out to a service provider. We do this stuff. It it feels almost like all day, every day sometimes. But we tend to have a lot of exposure to these things and can certainly be helpful in that area.
Yeah, that is a good point, that sometimes there are dedicated experts in industry that deal with that day to day, and reaching out and touching on that expertise is probably get you the most correct answer.
Yeah, and I mean, I'd say apart from that, being on top of, understanding the regulations that apply to you, whether it's PIPEDA or PCI or probably a bunch of other things. Just there are places you can go to get that kind of information. The reason I kind of go first to a consultant is, my area expertise is PCI, and let me tell you, there are so many things in PCI that are open to interpretation.
Right.
That if you're just reading it, it may seem very ambiguous. So sometimes it takes, like, I mean, myself, I've been involved with PCI for over a decade, and there are many times where a question comes up and I'm asking around to get some other people's input on it. Some people who have been doing PCI literally since PCI became a thing, and to help understand and interpret the requirements and how they apply. So, certainly, like I say, there's lots of information out there, but I would definitely encourage people, whether it's us or anybody else, if you can get a hold of somebody has some expertise in the area, then by all means, I think that's a good plan.
Very good. And I missed a question from our previous topic, so forgive me for that, but maybe taking a step back, another question that was in the chat was, does the caller know that the recording has been paused when they're providing sensitive data? Are they made aware?
Yeah, so I mean, again, there's multiple systems that can be implemented to help reduce this risk, and part of that is within the flow. If we're talking about something, for example, that's an agent-assisted transaction, basically what will happen is, and you talk about the different technologies that are implemented to do this. In the case that I've been a little more intimate with using 5.9. Basically what it is the agent will let the caller know prior to entering any of the sensitive information that that their information is secure, right? So you have some messaging up front to the client itself, and when they go and basically conference in that the IVR to capture the payment, it is automatically at that point, the recording's automatically paused, and it's really done through a concept of communication between the agent scripting and letting the customer know that they will not be, it won't be recorded during that process.
Right on. Very good. So maybe back to timing and when is best to introduce security in a plan. Dennis, is there a cutoff time when that's appropriate, or is it ever too late? Is that a concept?
Yeah. So is that a concept? No, it's never too late. Obviously, Ed mentioned earlier on, the earlier you could get to it, the better. But on the other end, obviously, we're all in different points in our contact centers and technologies that we have in place. And, on the other hand, it's brought up, it's getting more and more, there's more and more events of this happening. So it never is too late to start addressing these vulnerabilities. And every moment that you are waiting is another moment that you have an unaddressed vulnerability that's out there. And there's a lot of different, we talk about vulnerabilities, and, we focused a little bit on payment and whatnot, but what are the different things that are involved as far as, we talk about securing? You have to consider your systems itself. Gord touched upon, patching. The patching exists across your actual, your operating systems, whether it's your local laptops and devices that your agents might be using, all the way up to the system's backend servers, right? You have to consider all of that. He mentioned a little bit about training. There never could be enough training from that perspective, to start to learn more about these exposures and what could happen. There's when you talk about other pieces to consider, your network security and segmentation of that, right? You're putting firewalls up, malware, encryption. Encryption involves your data transactions, and making sure that you are providing a good solid encryption, and any of your front end and back end systems are communicating using encrypting. This will help reduce your vulnerability, harden everything up. And we mentioned a little bit before, and maybe Gord, you could touch upon it again, but we talk about, even in all these transactions, whether you're going through the web or IVR or whatnot, there's logging that happens, right? And so part of that is making sure that you are, removing any sensitive data from those logs, along with making sure the right people have access to them, just to protect yourself and your customers.
Yeah, maybe I'll throw in a little note there just about audit logging. So, I mean, just to give you an example of how important the PCI Council sees logging, is that they require you to retain audit logs of basically every system that's touching cardholder data for a year. And that's because they want the ability, if something happens, to be able to understand exactly what happened by whom. And another aspect of that is, in order to correlate different events in your logs, they require all these same systems to have synchronized time. So, they they place a very high importance. In fact, of the 12 major PCR requirements, one of those is essentially dedicated entirely to logging.
Okay, good. And then I forgot to mention too, we talked about let's address it up front and it's never too late. But it's also important to know that it's not necessarily a one and done, right? When you talk about security, it's constantly evolving. The risks are constantly evolving. Compliance requirements are constantly changing. So with that being said, you really have to look at it as it's best to address it up front. Part of that gives you a plan to be able to continually reevaluate that. And that's something to consider too. It's not necessarily like you go in there, you do your thing, and then you wipe your hands and done.
Yeah.
Obviously those risks are going to be out there and ever evolving. So you really need to continually reevaluate that. Whether the timing of it, you mentioned a little bit about high risk, right? Vulnerabilities might have to be something that's applied within X amount of days, 30 days, et cetera. There's different levels of risk. So you have to basically plan out when and how you're going to address those vulnerabilities based on the type of risks that happen. And you mentioned PCI. It's not necessarily, I have knowledge of it, but I think, Gord, you might be a little more experienced with that. PCI, those requirements are even changing, right? So
Yeah.
those will help drive what your reevaluation period is. And tell me about maybe a little bit tell us about the PCI compliance, how often they might change and what some of these changes mean.
Yeah, so I will, just don't let me forget to get to that. But before I forget, I wanted to talk. You talked about continually reevaluating risk. So the current PCI requirement is actually that you have to perform a risk assessment annually. But the upcoming version of PCI, version 4.0, which is coming into effect next year, but there are some of the tougher requirements in PCI 4.0, and like I say, don't let me forget, I'll go through some of the real big ones. But some of the more difficult new requirements are coming into place for any assessment completed after March 31st, 2025. So, I know people are probably hearing this and going, "Oh, that's like more than 2 years away." Well, some of those things need a pretty long runway. Anyway, so the on the subject of risk assessment, the new version of PCI, version 4.0, has actually done away with a large risk assessment, and instead there are actually a number of what they call a targeted risk analysis, and there are 9 different requirements that require a targeted risk analysis to be done. So if your company doesn't have experience in doing risk assessments, it would be a pretty good idea to, basically get good at that fairly soon, and and develop a methodology for performing them. And PCI version 4 does have some guidance on how to conduct them, so that's a good source. Of course, we'd be happy to help you out with that if it's something that you're going to need. And yeah, so anyway, like I say, I'll get to the bigger 4.0 things, but on the subject of risk assessment, that's how things are changing.
Right on. That's a good summary of that topic. Thanks, guys. Maybe we're going to jump and skip ahead. I'm going to jump to the next overarching topic. So let me just share our reference slide. And from there, maybe this is one that I can maybe kick off. But are there different security considerations for contact center as a service, CCaaS versus on-prem deployments? So it's probably no secret that for anyone listening or participating today that we're moving to a cloud-based world of computing. Contact center not excluded there. So with these cloud platforms, they've introduced kind of the shared responsibility model. So what that essentially means is that these platforms put out there all the tools necessary to establish or enact security measures when it comes to data storage, data transition or transmission, and I guess, securing whatever applications are being hosted out in the platform. Those tools are there and available, but the responsibility does lie on the user or the subscriber to that service to make sure that they're implemented correctly for their personal needs. Everyone's business could be different and may lead to different requirements. So the onus really does fall on the subscriber to those services to make sure that they are adhering to the standards that they need to for their compliance, their business, and things of the like. So what are some things to keep in mind? I mean, when engaging with a service provider such as a CCaaS platform, they are hosting their solution out in the cloud as well. So it's important when evaluating your vendors to make sure that they are meeting those requirements that you need. When it comes to things that we've talked about, PCI, if you're collecting credit card data, or what would be PIPEDA for the health industry, personal information securing and things of that nature. Making sure that there's encryption on the data transmission that's going outside of what typically would have been within your firewalls on a premise deployment. Those things are important to now consider, because you're now extending your communications, your data storage to other locations. I don't know if we had a story around that to relay, but I thought you had
I can think of one related to use of service providers and the importance of ensuring that they're doing what they need to. So there was one of my colleagues actually performed an assessment. I was sort of peripherally involved of a large Canadian municipality, and they were using a service provider to perform DTMF tone masking. So you heard me talk about that before, and we talked a lot about service providers. So I think it's important to realize that it's not a panacea. It's service providers are great, but it's still, if your service provider has a breach, it's your customer data that's being being taken by cyber criminals. So it's really in your best interest to be sure you're being extra careful and extra sure. So this municipality was using this service provider to perform this DTMF tone masking, and and this was a substantial company that had many clients. And in the course of the PCI assessment, we reviewed, we listened to the call recordings, something we normally do, because if a client says, oh, we're using DTMF tone masking, or we're using pause and resume, we check. It's like, okay, let's pick some days, let's listen to some calls, let's make sure that it's effective. And when we listened to the call recordings that were supposedly masked by this provider, the technique they were using was, I think they actually called it DTMF tone obfuscation. And it was their own kind of proprietary thing. And what they were doing is, on top of a 16-digit credit card number, they would just intersperse random other tones, so that it made it so that if somebody was trying to decode that with some software, it would make it more difficult for them. But when we listened to it, it was absolutely clear which digits were the customer entering their card data. And it would be relatively trivial for an attacker to basically filter it by the volume level or whatever, to pick that out. So we had to call it out, and it was a major finding, and that municipality actually changed service providers. It was such a big problem that there was just no way it was going to get solved. So and another thing about, just since I'm on DTMF tone masking, there's actually an issue that's known as DTMF bleed. And I know I'm probably at risk of going off into the weeds here a little bit, but it's something that is worth checking. And what it is sometimes these DTMF tone masking solutions aren't fast enough at replacing the tone. And what can happen is there can be a very, very short, maybe it's 20 milliseconds or less, just at the beginning, the initial, when they press the key to create the tone, where that actually gets recorded, that doesn't get masked. And there is technology out there that can actually decode those tones as short as 3 milliseconds. So, there are tools out there, I mean, including free tools, that where you could actually take a recording and essentially slow it down, pick like a little snippet right where they're entering the tone and see if it's present. So, um, if anybody wants some advice on that or some tips, they can get in touch with us, and I can find them something to help them out.
So basically, you're saying don't assume that the providers are fully
Yeah,
compliant, right?
yeah,
You need to do some level of validation yourself, right?
yeah. It's important. I mean, from the, on paper, it's important to ensure they're validated. So if they're providing a service to you as as a PCI service provider, you do need to validate that they're going through the right steps to be assessed. But also, it's important to actually verify yourself for the sake of your own company and for your own customers' data, that it's actually effective. And I mean, in this example, that service provider, they should not have passed their PCI assessment. There's no way that should have gotten through. And if we hadn't tested the effectiveness of that, we would have known either.
Wow. Yeah, very good. So good catch there for sure. Maybe one last factor to talk about when you're thinking about cloud solutions is that there could be pieces of the solution hosted in data centers around the world. So depending on your provider as well, it's good to check out where they're deployed, just in case that there's within your own environment a data sovereignty requirement of remaining within borders, federated borders, things of that nature. It could be even broken down to just basic little snippets of data that are executing on API calls or things that are overall the solution may be hosted within Canada, but little snippets could be done and sent, let's say, to a data center in the United States to provide a result back for a micro function that then continues within the overall solution within the Canadian border. So something to consider there, making sure that if that it is an issue, is a requirement that you're getting those answers when evaluating providers and out in the cloud, and making sure that you meet those. Very good. All right, so we're going to move on, and let's see. I'm gonna share our next topic. Bear with me, please. All right. Now we're going to move on, and maybe I'm going to start with Gord again on this one. This is where you told me that to not allow you to forget about 4.0 and PCI 4.0 and
Yeah.
talking about those big topics. So how do
Yeah.
regulatory changes impact the roadmap?
Yeah. Now that you've reminded me, the key thing will be, now you have to stop me when I talk too long about it.
Right, for sure.
So there are a number of changes with PCI 4.0 that can have some major impact. And so most of these, if not all these I'm going to talk about, are the ones that are, they don't come into effect until March 31st, 2025. But the reason for that is they're expecting people to start working on this right away so they can be ready. So the first one is that many organizations that handle card data, they have to do internal vulnerability scanning of their systems. So that's running some vulnerability scanning software that will essentially, in an automated fashion, look for vulnerabilities in all your systems. And up till now, you've been able to run that as if the thing has no access to the system. And starting with the change with 4.0, those scans will have to be credentialed. And what that means is the software will actually have access to everything on that system. And the result of that is that a system that looked clean basically from the outside, when it can scan with full access, like administrative level access on the system, it's going to find, every little software component that you're using, Java, libraries with the code you've developed yourself. There could be dozens or hundreds of extra vulnerabilities even on a single system that it finds. And so, this is probably one of the biggest things we've been telling people about this, that they need to start getting prepared for this, because there may be a whole lot of things that they don't even know about that could take a substantial amount of time just to get on top of as well as ongoing. And that's the first one. Another one is some companies, depending on the way they operate, will have to do external vulnerability scanning, and that's using what PCI calls an approved scanning vendor. And the up till now, people who are like that practice hasn't really changed. What is changing is that even companies that have virtually outsourced just about everything are going to have to do one of these vulnerability scans. And what it does is it actually looks for vulnerabilities from outside your network. And so that's something that they won't have had any experience with before, and that could reveal some things that that need addressing. Next one is, and again, this kind of relates to companies that are outsourcing a lot of things. What's going to be required is technology that will actually test the code on your payment pages to make sure that that code has not been replaced or modified. So even if you're outsourced, that if the traffic is coming to your server and then being redirected to a service provider, you'll have to actually have technology that will ensure that those scripts haven't been modified. Next one is if you do have a cardholder data environment, so whether it's spoken or DTMF tones transiting your network, or you're storing cardholder data, any access to that network or to that what we call a cardholder data environment has to use multi-factor authentication. So that could involve new technology as well as an adjustment by users. So there's some changes there that could take some time. Next one is, and I'm already apologizing because this could sound a little bit overwhelming, but anyway, we'll forge on ahead. If you are hosting a web-facing application, so let's say your call center, you also have an option where people can log in through their browser and make a payment or update their account or something like that. If you're accepting payment data, you have a web-facing application, it's mandatory to have an automated solution against web-based attacks. So normally that's what we call a web application firewall. So you have to, that can be a sizable investment, or there are cloud providers who can handle it for you. But that's definitely something to think about. You heard me earlier talk about the targeted risk analysis. So some of those things that you actually have to do those targeted risk analyses for are things like the timing of your patching for anything that's not a critical patch, the frequency of your malware scans. If you have, let's say you have some kind of an option where people can, pay with their card, like come into a walk-in center or something like that, you have to, the timing of the inspections of those terminals, and there, like I mentioned earlier, there are 9 different requirements that require these targeted risk analysis to be done. So, there's a lot there that that will need to be done. Next one, this is a fairly straightforward one. The current minimum length of passwords with PCI is 7 digits or 7 characters, and they're lengthening that to 12. So unless you have, they do make an exception for systems that aren't capable of 12, in which case the minimum is 8. But depending on the number of systems you have and the variety of systems, that can be a bit of a task to get through that. You have to have a technical solution that will detect and or protect against phishing attacks. Another one is that if you're storing, like if customers have to enter a CVV code, then that has to be stored encrypted now if you have to store it before the payment is taken, or before the payment is processed, sorry. There are additional training requirements. So yeah, there's quite a lot, and one thing I will say is that like I say, I'm sure this feels a little bit overwhelming. What we've started to do for some of our clients is basically help them do a gap analysis to just understand what these changes are going to mean for them, because depending on on systems they have. Some of these may be very easy, some of them may be very, very difficult.
Yeah, it sounds like it could be a lot of effort and cost related to some of these things, Gord?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. In fact, if the people on the call here, if they've got some transformational changes that they're thinking of or planning for their contact center or for payment systems, definitely I would say, um, like, you should be thinking of some of the things we've talked about for service providers, and ways that you can minimize the scope of what PCI will apply to in your environment. So
Gord,
if you can.
just sorry to interrupt you, but we just had a question from Cheryl, which is a good one. And goes, what new PCI 4.0 requirements are the biggest concerns for call centers, you would think?
Oh, what's the biggest one? I'd say, um, probably the authenticated scanning one. For a lot of organizations, that's going to be probably the the biggest one. And I'd say, maybe if I'm looking at, say, top two, maybe the requirement for multi-factor authentication into your cardholder environment. Those two things could require both technology changes and educating users and policies, and there's a whole lot of things involved in that. So yeah, I'd say those are probably the top two.
Right on. Good question. Good question. Maybe for sake of time, we could move on. Just maybe flip this over to Dennis, because I know this is Dennis's wheelhouse. What considerations within a secure pay type solution in CCaaS we need to consider with all these PCI changes and things? So Dennis, maybe you could speak a little bit about secure pay.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk about secure pay. What does it mean? So there's a couple different types of transactions, and I kind of like to talk about it in real life use cases, right? So you have the transaction where maybe a caller is just calling in and entering some information into an IVR to pay a bill or do something to that degree, and we'll call that self-service, right? Where there's no agent interaction with that. And then there's the other kind of genre of it where you're calling in, you get routed down to an agent, and whether it's through some sort of bill pay or you're in some sort of OMS system where they're creating some sort of order, that you basically have an agent and a caller on at the same time. And at that point, you're going to go through the process of collecting the information that is needed to submit that transaction. So what does that mean? What does that require? How do we go about doing that? So basically what you're having is you have a caller on with the agent, and the agent's going to basically prep up any of the bill payment processing. So there's certain items that are not sensitive but are essential to the transaction per se. So maybe collect the username, make sure that they validated what account in general that they're on and whatnot. And at the point that they're going to be saying, okay, now we're going to process, we'll say, a credit card, debit card, or even ACH, right? At that point, what's going to happen is the agent will be able to go ahead and let the user know that I'm going to bring you into our payment IVR system right now, and give them the vote of confidence at that point too, that none of the information that they're going to be entering is going to be exposed in any way, shape, or form. So it's going to be secured. That transaction is going to be secured. So they're going to go ahead and conference the user in for the card collection process into this IVR. The moment that they conference in, what happens is, and Gord touched upon it earlier, is that any call recording, most contact centers have some level of call recording. When they go ahead and say, okay, we're going to start the secure payment transaction, that call recording is going to be paused automatically. So no errors can be made, we'll say, by the agent itself of making sure that they pause their recordings if that functionality is available to them. The system will automatically pause the recording. So as you're getting into the IVR, that information won't be exposed from a recording perspective. Also, what's going to happen is the agent will be muted from that conversation. So because the agent's muted, they won't be able, that's how you can mask the DTMF tones and or speech, depending on what type of payment processor input modules you have in place. And that way, any of the information that's spoken or Gord touched upon it as far as the DTMF tones, the agent will be able to have that available to them. And then once they get into that IVR, that's when you start to get the processing of your card information. So you'll get the please enter your card number, please enter your expiration date, and all those nice prompts that go along with that. In this function, in this feature, the agent will be allowed to track the progress of the user during this process. So there'll be notifications back to the agent to say users entering the card number, users having problem with the card number if they're having input problems, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, totally being isolated from the transaction itself. So the reduction of risk right there is just awesome. And then ultimately in the end, you have your logs. So the moment you implement this feature, any of the logging that happens, you'll have your sensitive variables will automatically be masked out, so they won't appear in logs. And then finally, from a back-end processor, we talked about your relationships with your merchants and whatnot. So the big deal is, having a relationship with a trusted merchant that will have a very tight encryption policy, and making sure that the data, when you go ahead and submit the actual transaction to the backend payment processor, that in fact it's securely encrypted. So by doing this and implementing these types of features, you've really mitigated and kind of isolated your risk from an agent contact center perspective to the caller itself.
So just hearing you talk about that, Dennis, reminds me of another client of mine, and basically it's kind of a success story, and they put in a lot of these technologies you've been talking about. So it's a large contact center, and they were taking payment data by phone and also via e-commerce, and they implemented tokenization for storage. And they also use a DTMF tone masking solution, and very much like we've talked about before. And basically, at the end of the day, they've been able to remove the call center workstations and their VoIP systems from PCI scope. So now PCI no longer applies to their basically to the entire call center. On the e-commerce side, because they use tokenization, they have no storage, and they use technologies on that e-commerce site so that it actually redirects the actual payment information when they're entering it out to a third-party service provider. So even basically what happens there is, if I'm using the e-commerce side, a self-service type approach, my credit card number is actually not entering into the call center's computer, it's entering into the service provider's computer. So it's been a hugely successful effort for them, in that their PCI assessment was much easier. And yeah, so maybe you also talked about that, the communication between the agent and the customer, and how the card data is being entered and all that. The solution that they used, and I think this is probably true of many of them, as the customer is entering the digits on their touchtone phone, the agent actually sees a little window pop up on the screen, and they're actually seeing the little asterisks get drawn across the screen as the person is entering their card number, and they can actually stay in communication and talk to the person the whole time through this. So it's actually quite miraculous that, this whole thing is going on. The agent is never hearing or seeing card data. They're never entering card data, and yet they're maintaining communication the whole time with their customer. So yeah, great success story. And maybe if one other thing, the just, a lot of these things we see so many of the things you talked about when we're doing PCI assessments of call centers. And I mean, PCI isn't really optional. It's, it's mandatory if you're accepting payments. But at the same time, the PCI standard is actually a very good and, quite a prescriptive security standard. And, the benefits, apart from, like I say, it's mandatory, is that, you're reducing your risk of data breaches, you're safeguarding your customers' cardholder data, you're reducing your chances for any sort of identity theft, and really you're protecting your company's brand's reputation. And and failing to maintain PCI compliance at the same time, you're increasing your risks of all these things, as well as the potential for fines. And I can think of one example where it's not just fines from PCI. You could be fined by, if you're a service provider, you could be fined by your customer. And I know one customer that had mentioned to me that if they don't complete their PCI assessment on time, they have to pay a fine of $10,000 a day. So it's very, very important to ensure these things are maintained.
That's great.
Yeah. And right, you talked about the finance and the fines, and again, you mentioned name brand. So there's two really big incentives to staying on top of this, right? You don't want to drag your name through the mud, and obviously any of the penalties that you get associated with it could have a huge financial burden. So yeah, that's good points.
Right on, guys. Well, that brings us to the end of our topics, and thanks, guys, for this great discussion and great information. While we invite Cheryl Stedman maybe to come back and help us with wrapping up, I'm going to share one last screen here, though. Online's great to offer for those who may be following along live or who watch this at a future date. We have an offering that if anyone's interested in PCI readiness, a complimentary 2-hour session would be made available by our director of PCI, Sherry Collis. And if anyone is interested that's watching it, could contact us through that email address you see on screen, info@obsglobal.com. So thanks, guys. Cheryl?
Excellent. Thank you guys very, very much. Hackers are getting more and more and more sophisticated, obviously, and I believe they have generated this entire industry to even exist, like this whole business of security and compliance and PCI and the whole bit, right? Like this industry has to keep up with that industry. How does the industry in general, I guess, and you guys specifically, how do you stay one step ahead of the sophistication of the hackers?
You know what? I'd almost say you just have to be like a total nerd. You just got to be, you got to like live and breathe this stuff. It's interesting because one of the things I've said to people is, if you're going to get into this industry, you better be a lifelong learner, because that's what's required. You have to be, reading and researching, and when you're dealing with customers, one of the greatest things I find working with customers is how much I can learn from them. Like there's a lot of people doing a lot of really neat stuff out there, and the more customers I get to talk to, the more cool things I learn about, and the more things I encounter that stir my mind to go out and figure out ways that we can help them, and solutions that are out there. So if you are the kind of person that loves that and loves to learn, and learn new things, that I think it's a critical factor in the field, and I think that's the secret sauce in staying on top of these things is just never stop learning.
Yeah. And Cheryl, just real quick to add on to that too. I myself, admittedly, have come more, I think I mentioned, from a DevOps perspective, right? So I'm helping implement some of these technologies. So obviously I have an awareness of it, but I think that kind of touches some of the points that we've been talking about along, because of the complexity and how much it's evolving. you need to have those geeks like Gord, right? And that's part of the whole idea of kind of going through the, service provider to help assist with that, because it is really something you have to live and breathe to kind of stay on top, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually
100%.
one other aspect too is the, internally within online, we have quite an active community of discussing things. And I mean, just to give an example, the people at online that do what I do, there's about 30 of us that do this job. And
Cool.
pretty much on a daily basis, somebody comes up with something new or something that they're not familiar with. And, we'll talk about it internally. They'll, bring up the subject on it. Our tool happens to be Slack, but our internal chat platform. And, sometimes that means we're all jumping on a quick phone call and talking about it. And, it's remarkable that with, basically 30 other nerds that are learning all kinds of different things from the customers that they deal with. I find it quite incredible that just about every time I come up with something, it's like, hey, has anybody got an experience with this? And somebody will jump in and go, oh yeah, I have a customer using that. Or yeah, I went to a conference and there was a speaker that was talking about that. So that, to me, that has been one of the most amazing things, is having this hive mind that I can turn to when it's something that I haven't encountered before.
Right. The power of many brains and many nerds.
Yeah.
Networking.
It's true. Networking.
Yeah.
And always looking for loopholes, right? Like, how can I break it? Can I break it? Because if I can break it, someone else will break it, right? So
we actually have a whole part of the company dedicated to doing just that. Trying to break it. I know. I think that's got to be one of the more fun aspects of cybersecurity is, people that go out and break stuff intentionally.
How can I think like a hacker? Right? Well, you know what? There's a job for them, right? So use your powers are good and not evil.
Yep.
That's
Awesome.
right.
Okay, well, guys, thank you so much. Is there anything else you wanted to add just in the last to wrap it up? We're good.
We are good. Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks, guys, for the great
Sure.
discussion.
My
Really
pleasure,
Thank you
Dennis,
all.
Chris, Gord.
Great.
Thank you guys so much, and thanks to Online for providing this webinar for us today. And if anybody has any questions or they want to reach out, there was the email address that Chris, you provided there on the last page. You can also reach them right here on our online community platform and just message straight onto their page. Look for under our partners list for online business systems. Thank you guys so much. Have an awesome day.
Awesome.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.